Everyone at Retrofighters wants to thank you for backing the Brawler 64 on Kickstarter. After the initial controller started to ship, we received reports of the L trigger button coming into contact with the analog stick when the analog stick is pushed into the upper left position and depressing the L trigger. Unfortunately, this was something we did not catch before production began. The team at Retrofighters takes this seriously, and we will be providing this retrofit kit, shown here, for all Kickstarter backers who would like them at no charge. Since the initial shipment of controllers shipped to backers, Retrofighters has also announced another iteration of transparent colored shells. Please note those controllers will not require any modification, as the design team incorporated all the necessary changes and redesigns from the original Brawler 64 into that controller. Please be assured the entire Retrofighters team is here for you, our supporters, backers, and fellow gamers. Our goal is for everyone who purchased a Brawler 64 to be 100% satisfied and happy. To help in that measure, we have worked to put this tutorial together to demonstrate the retrofit process to make it as easy as possible for you to continue to get your game on. The retrofit kit comes with a front and back shell of the Brawler 64. The L&R trigger come pre-installed for you. Separate A and B buttons are also included. Now, to perform this modification, you will need several common tools. An assortment of Phillips head screwdrivers to get into the controller itself, and at one point, a side cutters or a snips will be helpful. The underside of the Brawler 64 features 1, 2, 3, 4 main screws, plus 2 additional screws where the memory card or the rumble pack would be inserted. You will need to remove all 6 of these screws. It is important to retain these screws, as you will use them again later. Once you have 4 screws pulled out, set those aside, and then remove the 2 screws in the memory card slot. Please note those 2 screws are slightly longer than the 4 main screws that hold the body together. There's one last screw to remove, and it is underneath this label right there. Peel the sticker off and remove the final screw. At this point, separate the halves of the controller. It is at this point that you will want to use the side cutters to help remove the last couple parts of the controller. This plastic bar here and here needs to go up and over the Z triggers. Now, you can depress these and try to stretch that out. However, since you will not be using this half of the case anymore, we found it easier just to cut those little bars off. At this point, you can dispose of the bottom half of the shell. Under the controller itself, you have 1, 2 small screws right there that we will undo. And at this point, the rest of the components of the controller should pull out. Be careful, you don't want to damage anything during this process. Once you are to this point, you will need to pull back on these small tabs here. Those retain the circuit boards that register when you push down on the L&R triggers. You can simply bend those back because, again, we will not be using this part of the controller again. And with that, the old electronics are out of the controller. We'll set those aside for later. Now, before you transfer everything to the new face of the controller, what you may want to do is take a permanent marker and just put a dash or a mark so you know which one is the old one and which one is the new one. We will install our new A and B buttons and transfer the C buttons. Transfer the start button, the turbo button, the clear button, and now at this point we need to transfer the components from the original A and B buttons to the new A and B buttons. Our D-pad. And finally, don't forget to remove and transfer those 2 pressure contacts right there. Now that all of the buttons have been transferred, we can start the reassembly process. Start with putting the trigger actuators back into position. And please note, there are rails here and here for them to line back up into. You may find it easier to insert the trigger actuators by removing the L&R trigger to begin with. Excellent. Now that you have the boards installed, go ahead and reinstall the L&R button if you remove them during this process. Check for free movement before you proceed. This is appropriate. You might find it helpful to hold the controller up as you go ahead and get everything back reinstalled into the face. Make sure too that you have all the buttons installed in the appropriate orientation, otherwise it will prevent the controller from closing up properly. Reinstall the 2 screws in the bottom part of the controller PCB. Before you tighten them down, it is useful to unscrew a 1/4 turn to make sure that the screw gets seated in the threads properly. Don't over tighten them, as they could prevent free range of motion later on. We're in the home stretch. This is perhaps the most complicated part of the entire reassembly process. Allow the controller cable to sit freely. We won't worry about getting that aligned quite yet. Installation of the back half of the controller can be a little bit challenging. Once you have the card slot lined up inside the back half of the controller, you'll go ahead and push the halves together. Don't do it too much, otherwise you will break the new half of the controller you just spent all that time installing. It may take a little force, but you'll eventually get it back together. Now at this point, reinstall the strain relief back into the 2 halves of the controller. The longer half of the strain release goes towards the back half of the controller. At this point, we are going to reinstall our 5 main screws before installing the 2 in the bottom. Do this in a star formation to ensure that the controller goes together without any binding or high spots. The final 2 screws to reinstall go in here and where the memory card goes or the rumble pack. They are also the 2 most challenging screws to reinstall. You may want to use a screwdriver that has either a magnetic tip or use a tweezers to set the screws in the slots, because otherwise when you go to install it, the screws may fall out of place. With those final screws installed, your Retro Fighters Brawler 64 should operate as intended. If you hold down the L trigger and push up, there is no longer any interference between the analog stick and that trigger. This completes the retrofit of the Retro Fighters Brawler 64 gamepad. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Retro Fighters via Facebook or Twitter on screen right now. And as always, go get your game on.